I'm reading a very interesting book about the economist Thomas Sowell. By the way, my former colleague at the Hoover Institution, someone I got to know fairly well, not extremely well, but fairly well over the years. And the book is called Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. It's by the Wall Street Journal writer Jason Riley. An excellent book so far. And I'll talk more about the book as I get further through it. But I thought as I'm reading through this, it's really strikes me the contrast between Sowell's just kind of limpid and Olympian and empirical work, the soundness of it, and the thoroughness of it, compared with the preposterous assertions of these pundits of critical race theory. I just saw something today on social media and I retweeted it. Nicole Hannah-Jones, and she goes, tipping is a practice that goes back to slavery. And then she goes on to say, have you ever wondered why tipping is only in America and nowhere else around the world? That's because it goes back to the slave plantation. This is basically Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'm thinking, this is one of the stupidest statements I've ever read. First of all, tipping is universal. I grew up in India. People tip in restaurants all the time. I've been all over Europe. Tipping is very common in Europe. So first of all, the idea that tipping is only American is nonsense. Number two, what is Nicole Hannah-Jones implying? I mean, slavery is a form of forced and unpaid labor. Is she saying that on the plantations it was normal practice for masters to tip their slaves? Hey, Frank, great job. Excellent service in the field today. Here's 50 cents for your efforts. What? I think historians worldwide are waiting with bated breath for Nicole Hannah-Jones to explain. And she's not going to explain because these are people who essentially say stupid things and expect never to be called on it. By the way, this topic of critical race theory is also going to come up with Judge Ketanji Jackson Brown. Brown-Jackson, I'm sorry. Marsha Blackburn was setting the stage for it in the little bit I saw of the hearings. She was raising the issue, and I'll delve a little bit more into it tomorrow. By the way, speaking of Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's really upset at all these laws that are being passed around the country outlawing critical race theory. Here's what she goes. Our New York Times journalism is being banned from being taught by name in state law. Let me repeat, our New York Times journalism, as though it's inherently scandalous that New York Times journalism is being banned. I mean, this to me is like, and this is my tweet about it. I say, this is like a golden apple, once ripe, but now rotten and crawling with maggots, protesting, no one wants me, but I'm a golden apple. Well, yeah, you used to be a golden apple. Now you're crawling with maggots. Well, back to Thomas Sowell, because here's a guy of true distinction. By the way, a guy who grew up poor, I guess he was born in Charlotte, but then was raised in New York City. He worked a variety of jobs. He was a Western Union messenger. He was a helper in machine shops. He was a civil service clerk until he was drafted into the Korean War. And then here's a guy who produced this kind of immense body of scholarly work. I believe more than 30 books. He's way ahead of me. And books that have a philosophical thrust and books that have an empirical thrust. Probably the work that has the most philosophical thrust was a book called A Conflict of Visions, 1987, which talked about the two kind of rival visions of the left and the right and how they're based upon two different understandings of human nature. One, the more, as Sowell calls it, constrained view, and the other, the more expansive view of human nature. I want to tell a couple of funny stories about Sowell because they kind of get to his personality. Sowell once told me that when he wrote his first book, I forget if it was Markets and Minorities or Race and Economics, in any event, Sowell said, I sent my book in to, I think it was Oxford University Press. It was 300 pages with all these footnotes. And he says, I didn't hear from them for a year. And then I got back my manuscript, and it was marked on every single page with questions and changes and notations and changes of the punctuation and the grammar. And basically, I guess what he says, what I thought they were saying is that if you want the book published, you have to make all these changes. And Sowell said, I basically sent the manuscript exactly the way it is without even going through it back to them and said, listen, either you publish the book exactly as is the way I sent it to you or don't publish it at all. And he goes, I didn't hear from them for another year. And then he says, finally, I got a package in the mail. I opened it, and it was my book published by them. So they decided to go back to the original, drop all their silly questions and punctuations and all their changes, and publish his book the way he wrote it. And this was Sowell. He was in some ways imperious in that he felt this is the way you do things, and I don't want to be trifled with. He was, in that sense, a person who knew what he wanted, but he was a careful researcher, and he was someone who had ideas but always tested them against the validity of experience. And I think that's what distinguishes Thomas Sowell and his magnificent career versus the shallow assertions of critical race theory.